Well, I'm not sure if anyone had planned, if we had planned amongst the committee to introduce Bess, but I can go ahead and do it. I think we're at 12:01 now, so we can go ahead and get started. We're happy to welcome Bess Koffman back to CCI. Many of you know Bess already, but she's been away for a few years now. She earned her undergraduate degree at Carrollton College in Minnesota in 2004, and she earned her PhD here in Earth and Climate Studies at UMaine in 2013, and is currently an assistant professor of geology at Colby College. So she is very near to us still, so we're grateful for that, and we are excited to hear about your ongoing work. And as a reminder to everybody, this is an affiliation talk for the Institute. And today, Bess will be presenting her work, Dust, Pollution, and Volcanic Ash, Tracing Sources and Impacts on Antarctica and the Northeast Pacific. Bess, I think you have ability to share screen, is that correct?
I think so, here we go.
Okay, well, I will turn it over to you. Welcome.
All right, thanks, Greg. I'm going to turn on my spotlight. And apparently I have to allow this. Let's see if I can just go ahead and play my presentation here. Yeah, I find the Zoom interface is a little challenging for being able to do things like use your mouse, but let me see if I can get the spotlight to actually turn on. No, that's okay. I'm going to minimize this Zoom window if I can. Sorry, I have to do this first here. No, I haven't had to teach in a few semesters now, so my Zoom interactive skills are clearly a little bit rusty. There we go. I'm going to minimize this. There we go. And go back to playing the slideshow. Somebody is chatting. Let's see if this is important. Oh, so request for people who are not me to mute. And I've lost my mouse again.
Bess, I think that when you use Keynote, because I go through this with George,
yeah,
you can't use the arrow when you the cursor is, you can't see it in full screen with Keynote.
Yeah,
that's why I've gone to, I usually use a PDF unless I have movement in it, but that's why you're not seeing it.
I do have animations, but what I'm not sure about is why I hit escape 5 times and it won't let me out of my own presentation, which is kind of weird. What I think I'm going to do, instead of having to deal with Zoom not giving me a highlighter, is just click through them this way. Well, but then we won't have our animations. All right, we're going to try this again. Bear with me. Okay. Well, thanks. Thanks for inviting me to give this talk as an affiliation talk with CCI. And it's my pleasure to see you all virtually. And I look forward to your input and questions. So I'm excited to share a few fairly new chapters in my research and sort of introduce what I've been doing lately to everyone. And as Greg mentioned, I'll be talking about dust pollution and volcanic ash sources and impacts in Antarctica and the Northeast Pacific. So I'd like to start by thanking my collaborators, so many scientists at UMaine and Lamont and at Bigelow and Dartmouth and a few other places as well. And especially undergrads who have been working in my lab and contributed really significantly to what I'll talk with you about today. And then funding agencies, including those at Colby and a couple national level ones as well. So To give you an overview of where we're headed, I'll talk a little bit about the scope of my research, dust as a tracer of climate and how we can use dust to learn about past changes. And then I'll highlight these three sort of recent areas of research. So we'll start with this overview. So my research began in the tide pools of coastal Maine when I was a kid, growing up on Mount Desert Island. After college at Carleton, I was fortunate to get a job at Palmer Station, where I did marine biogeochemistry research with Hugh Ducklow at the Palmer LTER, and then applied to UMaine because that's where I wanted to go, and an opportunity to work with Carl Kreutz on the Waste Divide Ice Core, which you see here, which was a wonderful opportunity that allowed me to go to the field for 2 field seasons when I was a student there at UMaine. I also got to meet people like this guy, some of you might know. And then from there, I went to Lamont Doherty and did a postdoc with Steve Goldstein, Mike Kaplan, another UMaine alum, and Gisela Winkler, where I learned some of the strontium, neodymium, and lead radiogenic isotope work that I'll share with you today. And then I went back up to New England and spent a couple years at Dartmouth working with Eric Osterberg, who generously pulled me into the Denali research project. So here I am with a couple undergrads up at base camp in 2016. And then from there, I was really excited to be able to come back to Maine. And here I am at Colby, which actually looks sort of like this today with this wonderful snow that we have. Some of you may know, but I also have a new addition to the family. This is Sylvan, who's now 13 months old, and he's a fan of the snow too. All right, so broadly speaking, I'm a geochemist and a paleoclimate scientist, like many people at UMaine, and I'm mainly interested in the sources, transport histories, and impacts of dust, pollution, and volcanic aerosols. So my research has taken me to some really awesome places, both in person and through samples that have come from other places, other archives. But today I'll talk about 2 projects in the Northeast Pacific and one that's sort of generally focused on Antarctica. And I'll share a few results along the way from some of these other projects. But I'm involved in a range of ice core projects, both in Alaska and in Antarctica, and some other interesting sort of dust provenance work in the Central Pacific and in New Zealand. So a few field photos here. So here's the West Antarctic ice sheet, which is also my backdrop today. This one should look familiar to some. This is the Rakaia Valley in the South Island of New Zealand, where I did my postdoc research. And then here's a beautiful Denali base camp with a couple undergrads and collecting some snow pit samples here. And then since I've been at Colby, mainly as a teaching tool, I've gotten into lake coring with some help from Andrea Nurse and others. So here are a couple of photos of recent trips with classes. So we've done some fun sort of, hands-on work, not necessarily my main research focus, but a nice way for students to get involved in paleoclimate research. Here are a couple of photos from an unusual sort of site. This is Christmas Island in the Central Pacific, where I went and collected some dust samples with Diane Thompson and her grad student Alice Chapman at the University of Arizona. We were actually in the field in January of 2020. So this is my last international field work for a while. And then with all these samples, we come back to the lab here at Colby and process them. And that is really how we spend most of our time, which is true of many of us, I'm sure. So here are a few photos of students working at the hoods. The student on the left is literally up there doing that right now. That's CC, she's one of my current research students. All right, so that's kind of an overview of what I do and where I've been. So let's talk a little bit about dust as a tracer of climate. So dust plays multiple roles in Earth's climate. It can impact Earth's radiative balance directly by absorbing, scattering, and reflecting incoming solar radiation, and it's also a tracer of past climate. This is a GIF showing dust coming out of the Copper River Valley into the Northeast Pacific. So some of these events can be really significant. And so, just thinking broadly about dust and why we care about Earth's radiative balance. Clouds are also really dependent on dust and other particles in the atmosphere. So dust plays a role in affecting planetary albedo and the distribution of clouds and precipitation. And dust is also an important source of iron and other nutrients. And so when it is deposited in regions that are limited by iron or other trace metals, it can actually fertilize bacteria and algae in the ocean and impact global carbon and nitrogen cycles. So this brings us to John Martin's iron hypothesis, which I bring up mainly because John Martin was a Colby grad from the 1950s. And he famously said, "Give me a half tanker of iron and I will give you an ice age," which, many people might debate, the details of that, but it has a good ring to it, right? All right. And then, of course, we also are really interested in using dust as a tracer. So dust affects the climate, but it is also impacted by climate change. And we can use dust, especially in ice core records, to trace changes in the winds and specific transport histories. And that's something that I really focus on a lot with my research. So of the different types of aerosols that we can see in this GIF here, soil dust or mineral dust is really the one that carries unique information about where that material came from. All right, so to summarize here, how can we use dust as a tracer of past climate? We can look at changes in the amount of dust through time. So dust flux, for example, in ice cores, and learn about changes in source regions and transport conditions, for instance, around the southern hemisphere. We can also look at changes in particle size distributions. So are dust particles getting coarser or finer through time? And if the sources stayed the same, then we can infer that, that the winds that are carrying that dust either got stronger or weaker. And then third, this is really what I do a lot of these days, is look at changes in geochemical composition through time. And so the tracer, main tracers that I use to look at that are strontium, neodymium, and lead isotopes. This is a diagram that just shows the relationship between epsilon neodymium on the y-axis and the strontium 87-86 ratio. So you can see how recent andesites and basalts that have sort of recently become part of Earth's crust would have a composition in the upper left of this diagram. So a positive epsilon neodymium value and a relatively low strontium 87-86 ratio. And as rock has been part of the crust for longer and longer periods of time, we would expect to see compositions that plot farther down on the y-axis with more negative neodymium isotope values and more positive strontium isotope ratios. So in addition to age, because these are radiometric tools that we have, the strontium isotope ratio is also affected by weathering processes. And so as weathering occurs over billions of years, what we see is a loss of strontium and an increase in the rubidium strontium ratio, which in turn drives up the 87-86 ratio. And so as sediments experience more chemical weathering, we see a shift toward higher 87-86 ratios for a given epsilon neodymium value. And so the reason that this is so useful is that different continental source regions, so bedrock and the sediments that are derived from that bedrock, carry these different sort of histories with them. So the history of metamorphism, exposure to weathering, age of the rock, et cetera, allowing us to generally use these tools to pinpoint the sources of dust. All right, so we can look at changes in the amount of dust through time. We can look at changes in the sizes of dust, particle size distributions, and changes in the chemical composition of that dust. And so ice cores allow us to do all of those things. But I'll also talk about some other applications looking at sediments as well. All right, so this first little vignette of research is focused on provenance tools and how can we actually improve these tools that I just mentioned, strontium, neodymium, and lead isotope tracers. And the reason that this is important is that, of course, we're interested in tracing dust from sources to sinks, right? We're interested in the sources of dust to the Southern Ocean. And we can use ice core measurements from Antarctica to help constrain those sources of dust, right? So we can ground truth models, like you see this image here, which is for the modern atmosphere. We can also learn about past changes in atmospheric wind patterns. But the problem is that in the Southern Hemisphere in particular, some of these main dust source regions have overlapping isotopic compositions. And that gives us limited ability to discriminate between these source areas. And so it doesn't always give us unique answers when we're looking for these, to trace the dust back to its sources. So this is a project with Sid Hemming and Steve Goldstein at Lamont. And just to give an example of sort of how these source areas overlap, this is from a recent paper comparing the composition of dust in New Zealand South Island to different source areas in South America. And what we can see is that this, the South Island dust, the red and pink symbols overlap in this epsilon neodymium strontium isotope space with some of the key source areas such as central western Argentina and Tierra del Fuego in South America. And then on top of those source areas, the stars are representing East Antarctic ice sheet dust measured during glacial periods. And you can see that those stars overlap with multiple of these source areas shown by the colored blobs. And so if we didn't have any other tools, we could argue that, well, New Zealand could be a major source, or central western Argentina could be a major source, or basically any of these places that you see plotted. And so we actually need to have some other sort of axes that we can use to help discriminate the source regions. And so one of those that we're exploring through this work is potassium argon geochronology, so looking at the ages of sediment. And the reason that potassium argon is really valuable in this context is that these ages can be reset by relatively low temperature processes like metamorphism, lower grade metamorphism, I should say, resulting in relatively young ages. So for a given neodymium isotope value, we might see younger potassium argon ages in Patagonia, as you see here, compared to New Zealand, South Island, it's shown in red in this plot. So here, this plot shows a few other sort of ways of looking at that. So looking at different isotope ratios, right? So we've been looking at strontium and neodymium. So that's shown in panel A. So you can see that there's a fair bit of overlap among these samples from these two source areas. And as we add in lead isotopes, which we see in panel C, in panel D, we can start to tease apart those areas a little bit more. But when we really combine these different techniques, such as in B and D with epsilon neodymium plotted versus potassium argon age, or the 207-204 lead isotope ratio plotted versus potassium argon in panel D, we can actually really tease apart these source areas. And so the goal of this project is to combine these measurements so we can do it all on really small samples and apply this to ice cores. So we're in the method development phase, and that is really what the project is focused on, is just figuring out how to make this work. So initially we pack small sediment or dust samples in these tantalum packets in the left-hand picture that you see here, and run them on the noble gas mass spectrometer. And then we take those, digest the residue inside the packet, and then put those through column separations, which you see in the right-hand picture, to isolate the isotopes that we want to measure. And then we measure those back at Lamont. So this approach should provide some additional leverage for using dust to answer some interesting questions, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, where we have these overlapping source regions. And one of those really interesting questions is, what happened to the Western Arctic ice sheet during the last interglacial? And so if the waste collapsed, we would expect to see a really strong shift from the most recent interglacial, like Holocene dust composition in East Antarctica. So the light blue circles that you see here, a shift toward more volcanic-like compositions, such as we see in West Antarctica. And so we're hoping to apply this to the new Hercules dome ice core, which should be really sensitive to changes in the Western Arctic ice sheet. Okay, so that's kind of that little piece of research, which is ongoing. We're kind of in the middle of it right now. And now we'll shift gears and talk about the Northeast Pacific and impacts of volcanic ash here. So the Southern Ocean, where we just were, is the largest high nutrient, low chlorophyll region in the world, but the Northeast subarctic Pacific is the second largest. And so here we can see that nitrate concentrations are not fully used up because there's a lack of iron. And so it's another iron limited region. And so inputs of iron from dust and volcanic ash can have an influence on the growth of phytoplankton and on the exchange of carbon between the atmosphere and the ocean. However, despite iron limitation, the subarctic Pacific is this very productive ecosystem with fisheries that are worth over 5 billion annually for Alaska alone. And it's very sensitive to climate change. So we're interested in how climate change will affect this region, particularly because there have been some observed declines in primary production, which have been associated with warming sea surface temperatures, decreasing wind stress, and declining dust deposition. And so, the sources of nutrients may shift as glaciers recede, there are changes in ocean circulation, et cetera, and in wind patterns that might influence sort of the input and composition of different terrestrial nutrient sources. And so volcanic ash is this intermittent but significant source of iron and other nutrients, generally not sensitive to climate change on these types of timescales, right? So just an episodic input. And a good example of this was the 2008 eruption of Mount Casatochi. So you can see here the satellite ash composite image and the model of that in the lower right as that ash cloud traveled across the Gulf of Alaska. And then the panel F is a graph showing the sort of elevated chlorophyll. And then you can see that in the time series in the upper left graph, right? So this peak in chlorophyll associated with this input of iron from Mount Casatochi. However, there might be additional sources. Volcanic eruptions are episodic, but actually we can also look at remobilized ash, which can be distinguished using Miser satellite imagery. And I'll get to why this is so interesting in a second. But what this is showing is some of the characteristics of erupted ash on the right and remobilized ash on the left. And so using this multi-angle satellite imagery, we can actually tell the difference between these two types of events and identify and actually develop sort of a time series of remobilized ash events in this region. And so overall, we're interested in understanding the role of volcanoes in supporting this iron limited ecosystem in the Northeast Pacific. And this is a project with scientists at Bigelow, including Kath Mitchell, Ben Twining, and Karen Stemieszkin, with support from the North Pacific Research Board. So there are a few different aspects of the project. We are, each of us has a different expertise. So I'm mainly focused on the lab geochemical analysis and looking at iron compositions in fresh and aged ash. But we're also really interested in how to improve satellite detection techniques to actually do a better job of correcting those chlorophyll signals. And we'll do some shipboard experiments looking at the impact of ash directly on phytoplankton on the Line P cruise in the Gulf of Alaska. And then finally, we're engaging with the Pribilof Islands community to incorporate traditional knowledge and legends about volcanoes and the role that they play in supporting the ecosystem. So we're mainly interested in this question about remobilized ash. And to date, we've looked at the impact of remobilized ash deposition related to 5 remobilized events from Shevelich volcano in Kamchatka. And what we can see here is that the satellite chlorophyll, like level 3 data, show an anomaly. So they're removing, so the algorithm that processes the data removes the ash signal to some extent, which you can see in the whited out regions in panel C. But that's only a small portion of what might actually be ash coming out from this remobilized ash event. Particularly because if you look at the lower panels, you see that the sort of measured peak in chlorophyll is actually the day of this event, and then you don't actually see so much the day after. So we looked at these 5 different events. These are the other 4, and you can see that there's what would be considered anomalous chlorophyll associated with each of them in relationship to the long-term mean from 2003 to 2016. And at first we thought, oh, this is cool. Like, you're seeing an impact of remobilized ash on the phytoplankton, but it actually seems like maybe this is related to an incomplete removal of the ash. The ash optical properties, are affecting basically the chlorophyll measurement, either in the atmosphere or the ocean or both, in terms of what the satellite is seeing. And so this makes us step back and actually try to improve those corrections so that we can get a better sense of actually what the impact is on phytoplankton. And so the goal is to quantify the magnitude of blooms associated with remobilized ash after we can figure out, how to make sure we're not accidentally looking at impacts of ash in the water or the atmosphere. So this is just showing for that first event that I showed, the standard atmospheric correction on the left and the proposed atmospheric correction. And this is work by Kath Mitchell at Bigelow. And these are we don't need to go into the details, but you can see the differences here. All right, and then we're also looking at the composition of fresh versus aged ash. So aged ash that was erupted and sat around in the environment for some length of time. And so we have some time series that have been radiocarbon dated from soil pits on some of these volcanoes that we can actually use to see how that composition changes, so that if that material were blown back out over the ocean, we would maybe have a better sense of the potential impact. So we've made some comparisons between ash from these 3 volcanoes, Redoubt, Augustine, and Pavlov, and compared them to glaciogenic sediments from Alaska. And so far, we've seen that the solubility of iron in the aged ash, which is shown as the pink symbols, is comparable to what we see in the glaciogenic sediments, the silt and loess, shown as blue and brown, and actually much higher than what we see in the freshly erupted ash, shown as the green symbols. So we're seeing higher cumulative iron solubility. These are through millicu leaches, so successive water leaches through the same amount of sediment, which is sort of a standard, if flawed, approach for trying to understand what kind of iron is actually relevant to phytoplankton. But it allows us to make some comparisons to other studies and look at fractional iron solubility. We've also done sequential iron extractions. So in this case, we take the same sediment and treat it with a sequence of different reagents to extract different portions of iron. So we're looking at exchangeable iron, easily reducible iron, and then other fractions, sheet silicates and oxides, et cetera. And then eventually we do an HF digestion and dissolve everything, and that's the residual iron fraction. And so the different colors here represent the extracted iron as a percent of the total iron for each of these different extractions that you see in the legend at the bottom. And so what we can see for those aged ash samples is that the light pink, which represents the easily reducible iron, so that's extracted by hydroxylamine hydrochloride, that fraction is actually comparable to what we see in the glaciogenic sediments, the blue and the brownish colors, and actually much higher than the lightest green that you see for the fresh ash, which is in green. So far, what we're seeing is that the composition of aged ash looks actually much more like sediments that have been ground up by glaciers, which are a well-known source of relatively bioavailable iron, compared to what we see coming, from these eruptions, Pavlov in 2016 and Redoubt in 2009, which actually most of the iron in those samples was refractory. So probably not as available for phytoplankton use. So coming back to why remobilized ash is interesting, one of those reasons is that in addition to the fact that we don't have any idea how often these events happen, the ones that have been studied actually show a summer-fall seasonality. So this coincides roughly with light availability, suggesting that iron from these remobilized events could be more, timely, more relevant in terms of timing for phytoplankton growth. And, because these remobilized events depend to some extent on wind conditions, temperature, and precipitation, we think that they may be sensitive to changes in climate. And so not only do we see generally a summer fall seasonality, but then, we imagine that could shift and potentially make these events occur a little bit earlier in the summer, for example, which would coincide with peak light availability. This is a webcam image from the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, which is a place that's had ongoing resuspension events throughout the 20th century and up through the present. For instance, about 30 events between 2003 and 2018. And these plumes go right over the iron-limited Gulf of Alaska. So we've just started, we got funded this past year, and so there's a lot more work to do, and that includes identifying and assessing the impacts of these remobilized ash plumes after developing the improved algorithm and with those corrections that I mentioned. We're going to look at 14 additional eruptions from 5 different volcanoes and do some additional iron composition analyses. So some of the ones that I've shown already, as well as synchrotron analyses at Argonne National Lab, which we've just gotten started. And that will allow us to get a better sense of how these lab measurements, things like the easily reducible iron, for example, how that compares to the iron oxidation states that we can determine using the X-ray spectra. And then we'll have we have 2 planned cruises on line P. We'll do iron addition experiments. And then finally, we're planning to go to the Pribilofs and visit the community of St. Paul several times, COVID permitting, and we're planning to develop a course called Volcanoes in the Ocean Ecosystem that will be targeted at 4th and 5th graders and give them some hands-on activities related to volcanoes and the ocean developed, for the Gulf of Alaska and Bering Sea regions. All right, so that's that sort of piece of recent research. And so finally, we'll talk about dust and pollution across the Western Arctic and some recent results from some provenance measurements there. For some context, many of you know Eric Osterberg, and during his PhD, he measured lead in the Mount Logan ice core and found that concentrations really rose in concert with Asian industrialization, even while, the good news, right, at the time was that the Clean Air Act and banning of leaded gasoline brought down lead deposition in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere. And that can be seen in these other ice cores from Devon Island, the Alps, and from Greenland. But, we still have ongoing lead, sort of increasing lead deposition in the Northeast Pacific. Ben Gross, who did his master's at UMaine with Carl, measured lead isotopes in the Eclipse ice core and found that the Eclipse ice core compositions showed a mix of different sources. So the ice core is shown in yellow here, and you can see the US ellipse. So those are US aerosols in that ellipse, and then you can see the Chinese ellipse down to the right of that, and the yellow dot sort of plot in between those two, suggesting both North American input of lead and Asian inputs between 1970 and 2001, which is the span of that record. And so we're interested in sort of how pollution sources, but also dust inputs have evolved since then, since these most recent data from around 2001, and how we can, determine different sources of dust and pollution, whether we see different signals as a function of elevation. And so to tackle this question, we collected a series of snow pits in Denali National Park from these sites that you see here. And here's another map showing the elevation profile. If we flatten it out, you can see in panel C here what those sites look like. And then the upper left map shows Denali, where those were collected in comparison to some of these other places. So the St. Elias Mountains shown by the red star, and some other locations that I'll show in the plots. So Barrow, Alaska, and some sites in the Arctic Ocean that were sampled by a Chinese research team and published in 2019. And then we also collected sediment samples from some of the major drainages in South Central Alaska in order to characterize the local dust composition, because as I showed you with that Copper River image, there is certainly local input of dust, and we wanted to understand how much of that was getting up into the snowpack in Denali as well. So what we see from these different ice course, or sorry, snow pit sites. So there are 3 samples from Denali Base Camp shown as orange circles. The yellow squares are the higher elevation snow pit sites from Denali, and then the stars in the upper 2 panels are from the Zdanovich et al. 2006 study from the St. Elias. And so if we take all of these samples and plot them relative to elevation, we see this trend with elevation. So we have, lower strontium isotope ratios at lower elevations, higher at higher elevations. We see the opposite with epsilon neodymium, which makes sense if you remember the way that those two tend to co-vary. And then with the lead isotopes, we see higher 206, 207 and 208, 207 ratios at low elevations and lower ratios at higher elevations. So already we're starting to see hints of different sources or different combinations of sources as a function of elevation. So if we then plot the, if we first we're focusing on just the dust, so we assume that the neodymium and strontium are both coming just from dust and not from any pollution sources. So here we're plotting the local sediments that I collected in 2016 as shown as blue diamonds, along with some other published data shown as teal squares from the Yukon. So that's our local South Central Alaska and Yukon Territory dust signature. And then we can compare that to different regions of China, different desert source areas. So those are listed in the bottom of the legend, which desert regions are kind of grouped together. And this is based on how other studies have done it. So it represents geographic areas that are also isotopically similar. So what we see here is that the low elevation Denali Base Camp samples, the orange circles, plot right on top of the field for our local source area, which is not a surprise. And the high elevation samples, so the ones both from the St. Elias and from Denali National Park, plot with higher strontium isotopes, lower epsilon neodymium, consistent with an input of dust from deserts in China. And so we can sort of estimate which deserts those are and what the contributions are from those different source areas. But in general, what we see is a mixture of local and high elevation, local and Chinese dust at high elevations. All right, but if we look at the lead isotopes, we see sort of a different storyline here. So the lead isotopes are kind of trending away from what a mixture of Asian desert dust and local dust would look like. So here the South Central Alaska dust is again the blue diamonds, and different Chinese desert dust and less samples are shown as the light purple circles. So if all we were getting was a dust input, we would see those high elevation samples up there somewhere consistent with the dust. But in fact, what we see is the samples are trending down and to the left, and actually following a mixing line between dust and Chinese ore sources, shown as the dark black circles. And so in this plot, I didn't mention it in the previous plot, but we're also looking at those samples from Barrow, Alaska and the Arctic Ocean, which follow this same mixing line between the local dust or some combination of local and desert dust from Asia with these pollution sources. So primarily what we think is happening is that we're seeing contributions from Chinese ore or non-ferrous metal smelting. And I'll get into this a bit more here. So we used MixIR, which is a Bayesian isotope mixing model, to quantify the source contributions using these different potential sources. And what the model shows is that for the high elevation sites, as well as for Barrow and the Arctic Ocean snow samples, Chinese coal and ore together contribute about 32 to 53% of the lead. At the low elevation base camp site, we see that about 70% of the lead is coming from local sources, which is consistent with what we would interpret based on the graph that I showed. So we see a pretty significant and measurable input of pollution lead in Denali as well as across the Western Arctic. This is supported by high split back trajectory modeling for the spring of 2016, which shows the main source areas being northern and northeastern China. And then if we compare to those eclipse ice core data that I showed earlier, we see that actually the 2000-2001 data points, the darkest blue colors here, are very similar to what we're measuring in Denali in 2016. And so we actually don't see a change in the composition of lead, of long-range transported lead pollution following the phase out of leaded gasoline in China, which is a little bit surprising because there is a shift in measured Chinese aerosols and urban aerosols. But in other sites in the Arctic, following the phase out of tetraethyl lead additives in Europe and North America, for instance, the Devon ice cap ice core didn't show a shift in the isotope compositions. And so what we think is happening, which is actually supported by emissions data, is that even though leaded gasoline, which was by far the largest contributor to lead emissions in China, even though that was cut out, coal burning increased dramatically, and also non-ferrous metal smelting and other industrial uses of lead ore increased, such that the balance of isotopes being emitted kind of on a countrywide scale, the composition of that lead didn't really change very much. So that's a bit surprising, but that's how we interpret that finding. All right, so I want to have plenty of time for questions. I think I will end there and try to get back out of my presentation so I can see everybody again. And thanks, everybody. So yeah, there's not too many people, so I'd say just jump in if you have any questions or thoughts.
Bess, how do you measure potassium argon age in dust in such a tiny sample? How does that work?
Yeah, we're definitely pushing the limit on sample size. So far with mixed results, but basically what we're planning to do, well, what we've done so far is to use sediments that we've already measured the isotopes on, and then take a very small subset of that sample and package it up in that tantalum packet. So we're talking like 100, 200 microgram samples right now. So that's kind of the scale that we're aiming for.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. So, you know, fingers crossed that it all works out, but that is what we're trying to do. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Kirk.
Just to follow up on that question, because I had the exact same question. So you're trying, I mean, you're obviously trying to do all these analyses on the same sample. Is that, I mean, if you're looking at argon and lead and so forth, are you limited to, I guess, really nice visible dust layers in the ice, or what sort of density of dust in the ice do you have to deal with? Are you looking for stuff that you can't see, or do you have to actually be able to visibly identify a dust layer?
You don't have to visibly identify it, but I think you would want to know how much dust you have because you've made some dust measurements and you sort of know what the dust flux is. So you'd want to have a big enough sample that you would expect to have a measurable signal. And so right now our target amount is about 100 micrograms of ice core dust. So however much ice it takes to get to that based on what the dust flux is at a given site.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, Bess. I love the polar work as much as anybody, but right about now, the South Pacific sounds pretty good. Could you say something more about what you're doing there? You mentioned you're looking at dust deposition and relating it to ENSO, but could you say something more about that?
Yeah, so Diane Thompson is a scientist at University of Arizona, and she has been working in the Western and Central Pacific atolls for quite a while, using corals to reconstruct. And one of the most promising proxies that they've developed is manganese calcium ratios in corals. And these are coral cores and chunks of coral that they can take cores from, but also just like collecting cores in sort of in situ coral in these lagoons, in these islands. And so then when they measure the trace elements along these cores, of course, they're able to look at annual layers and stuff. They see these big peaks in manganese calcium associated with ENSO, with El Nino events. And those, of course, are associated with wind reversals. And so instead of predominantly southeasterly trades, you get shifts towards some, more westerly winds. So as far as I understand, the reason they think this works so well is that the atolls are largely sort of set up so that the lagoons are on the western side of the islands. And so they're fairly protected from the trade winds. But when you get the wind reversals, the lagoons are then more in the line of the stronger wind coming right over the ocean that doesn't get slowed down by blowing over any land. And so the lagoons are hit by stronger wind during El Nino events. And then that stirs up whatever sediment is in the lagoon and gets it into the coral matrix. And so the idea is that there's dust deposition over time that just, it's not necessarily related to El Nino or La Nina or whatever, but it's just getting into the lagoon, but then it gets mixed in so that you get this peak in manganese from the dust. And so my role is to help quantify the dust flux to the islands. And hopefully, if we can isolate that dust well enough, do some geochemistry on it and actually try to figure out where it's coming from, because there's very, very little dust being deposited in the middle of the Pacific. So they had put dust traps out in December of 2018, and then we were there in January of 2020, so about a year, and we went around and collected these dust samples from these little traps. Different types of traps. Some were little, some were big. The little ones probably worked better. I think the big ones got a lot of local carbonate in them, which made them challenging to work with. But yeah, it's been tricky getting the dust out of the samplers, like these little samplers. So to be determined, because we're really trying to weigh the dust, and you have to. The dust was collected in HDPE and rayon fiber, and rayon, you should be able to dissolve it and make it go away, but it hasn't worked very well. So that's a challenge. It's just like getting the rayon separated from the dust, and then the same thing with the fiber. So we've been sieving the fibers out and stuff, but I'm not totally sure how to get rid of the last little bits of fiber, and we don't want them contributing to our mass that we're trying to measure. But yeah, so I'm helping kind of close the loop on this proxy development to then apply to corals.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, Bess, another interesting aspect with regard to the manganese is that it's very photoreductive. And of course, when you have your El Nino events, you're getting a lot more warm water coming across. In other words, it's been exposed to sunlight a lot longer. And so you may end up having interesting recycling, greater amounts of manganese recycling happening as a consequence. I don't know whether how that plays into the role, but your collaborator may be able to have know more about that than I would at this stage. Yeah,
that's interesting.
I've got another question, if I could. In one of your early slides, you had you were showing the plot of your epsilon versus your strontium ratios in Antarctica, and you had the stars. And if I understood right, the stars on that plot were basically what you're measuring in situ. And what it seemed to me, and it just came to me just before you changed, so I'm not sure this is right. It seemed to me that those stars were more or less lined up so that there was very little change in, or relatively small amount of change in the strontium ratio, but more change in the epsilon. And I'm just wondering if I understood you right, does that mean that there is less weathering of those?
I might share my screen so we can take a look at that plot.
What I'm
So,
wondering is, once they're in the ice, of course, there's not going to be much weathering at all.
right, yeah, when I'm talking about the weathering, we're talking like hundreds of millions to billion-year timescales. So where we see variation in ice core dust compositions, for instance, and these are all recent, right? These are from the last couple interglacial periods. We're just looking at mixing. We're just looking at the mixing of different sources, not inferring anything about weathering on those timescales. But here where we see a lot of change in the epsilon neodymium and not much change in the strontium isotopes, the unusual thing here is that West Antarctic volcanoes, some of them have a composition that's sort of up here in this plot. So normally we kind of expect to see sort of upper left, lower right, and you kind of get this spread going this way. But in this case, where you have mixing of potentially South American, probably central Western Argentina is the main source to the East Antarctic Plateau, mixing of that with waste volcanoes, you can actually get this sort of vertical sort of pattern of the mixing line.
I understand now. Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And with my work in New Zealand, we were actually able to show that there was no difference in the, there's no impact of chemical weathering on samples from dated deposits from the last 78,000 years. So we had sediments that had been, dated by people like Aaron Putnam and Mike Kaplan, and, some coastal sediments dated by Ann Rowan, and, just like these different places where we had a good sense of how long the sediments had been sitting there. And there was really no effective chemical weathering on those timescales from like 12 to 78,000 years ago.
Okay, any last minute questions for Bess?
Yeah, Bess, you showed the example of Kamchatka, and it seemed to me that you were saying that that was fertilization effect, or was it simply showing the chlorophyll fields in that region?
So the point there was that if we just took it at face value, it would imply that there was a fertilization effect by that ash, because it was, what we were looking at was an increased chlorophyll signal. So an actual chlorophyll anomaly relative to the time series mean for, those days over the last 13 years or whatever. But, I think it's not something we can take at face value. I think we have to assume that the ash in the surface water and in the atmosphere are both affecting that satellite measurement of chlorophyll. And that the ocean color is going to, be green, whether it's a phytoplankton bloom or sediment in the water. And so I think that some of that color is being essentially misinterpreted. And so it's not my area of the project, but Kath Mitchell is the one who's an optical oceanographer. So she's going to do some experiments with, putting ash in the water and measuring that, and sort of, I guess, through all this work, we'll figure out the best way to improve those corrections to remove the kind of what you think of as maybe erroneous chlorophyll. It's not actually chlorophyll, but it's the ash contribution to that signal.
Yeah, so I would think that at this same time, you also have localized radiative cooling. I mean, we see that in the Atlantic, about half to even couple of degrees of it in the mixed layer from the Saharan dust. And so if you're thinking of phytoplankton plankton as such, the radiative and shielding effects, I would imagine, would also play a role.
For how long do you see that local radiative cooling?
I mean, that's on, at least in the Atlantic, it's at this sub-seasonal scale, and if you have multiple episodes, it does show a seasonal signal.
Okay, and these are also sort of smaller magnitude eruptions that you're talking about?
It'll be in the this is in the Atlantic SST and the mixed layer, essentially about half to a degree cooling effect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and you're talking about like a localized effect from a smaller eruption. We're not talking sort of larger scale cooling or anything.
Yeah, so I'm just talking about this Saharan dust.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's what you said. Saharan dust.
Across
Okay.
the Atlantic, yeah.
Right. Sorry. I did hear that. I just forgot that that's what you said. Saharan dust. Okay. So then that would imply a negative effect on phytoplankton, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I guess I'm not the expert, except I would think that if you have less insulation or short wave, I guess it would impact photosynthetic activity, I guess, in the short term.
Mark, can you weigh in on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, it all depends on I mean, you got to think about the whole dynamic. So it all depends on how much the cooling of the surface water there is, and what does that do to the density relative to the water below the picnic line. Because if you cool by a degree and you coincide with a storm, then you may actually bring more nutrients up and stimulate a phytoplankton bloom after the storm, after the dust event. So it gets very complicated knowing exactly what the overall balance is. And the other thing is to keep in mind is just because you see dust in the atmosphere doesn't mean that it's going to the ocean. I have a colleague that was measuring surface iron in a flow analysis system behind a vessel that was underway, and they had a major dust storm coming out of China and passed right over them, and his iron concentrations never changed. So the dust was going over, but it wasn't necessarily hitting the surface. So there's you've got all those dynamics to keep in mind. Now, in the situation you were talking about, very close to an eruption, obviously there's a lot of dust going into the ocean. But maybe some of these ash resuspension events that's moving the smaller size fractions out over the oceans, it doesn't necessarily mean you're leaving a uniform, deposition plume underneath it.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're at about time. So Bess, we thank you very much, and we'll be in touch soon.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you.